fertilization if re-elected to the White House. In a bid to appeal to women voters, Donald Trump says his government or insurance companies would pay for the costly IVF treatment. A Ukrainian F-16 jet crash is killing the pilot. This just weeks after Kyiv received its first batch of the lethal aircraft. Ukrainian officials say there is no evidence of pilot error as they investigate the crash. Taiwan detects almost 25 Chinese fighter jets and nearly 9 vessels around its territory. In response, Taiwan mobilizes its jets, warships, and missile defense system to counter any potential threat. Turkey arrests over 100 suspects affiliated with the Islamic State terror group. Police officials say the raids took place across the country, including Istanbul and the capital, Ankara. And Nigeria becomes the first African country to obtain Mpox vaccines. The United States sends 10,000 vaccines to the West African nation as the continent reports almost 4,000 new cases every single week. We begin in the Middle East. Israel and Hamas have agreed to pause fighting for 3 days to allow the World Health Organization to carry out a polio vaccination drive in Gaza. The humanitarian pause will allow health officials to administer the first dose of polio vaccines to almost 640,000 Palestinian children under the age of 5. The agreement comes just days after the United Nations said that a 10-month-old baby in Gaza had been partially paralyzed due to polio, becoming Gaza's first case in over 2 decades. Now, polio is a highly infectious virus and is most often spread through contaminated water. Children that test positive for polio can be affected by disfigurement of the limbs, paralysis, and even death. Now the humanitarian pause will begin on Sunday and will take place between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. local time. The vaccination drive will be held in central, southern, and northern Gaza, and almost 1.3 million doses of the novel or oral polio vaccine type 2 have been sent to Gaza, with another 400,000 doses on the way. The World Health Organization said its officials aim to achieve almost 90% vaccination in the Gaza Strip during the 3-day ceasefire.
We welcome the commitment to area-specific humanitarian pauses and suspension of evacuation orders for the implementation of a 2-round polio vaccine campaign set to begin on the 1st of September in the Gaza Strip. During each round of the campaign, the Palestinian Ministry of Health, in collaboration with WHO, UNICEF, UNRWA, and other partners, will provide 2 drops of WHO pre-qualified novel oral polio vaccine type 2, NOPV2, to more than 640,000 children under 10 years of age.
Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has clarified that the 3-day humanitarian pause is not a complete ceasefire. Israel's military added it will oversee the vaccination drive and will keep its troops deployed across Gaza in large numbers. Israel's allies, including the United States and the United Kingdom, have welcomed the polio vaccination drive. Now it remains to be seen whether Washington will use the 3-day humanitarian pause as a way to convince Israel and Hamas to a pathway to a longer ceasefire. And here in the United States, Vice President Kamala Harris, along with her running mate, Governor Tim Walz, gave their first joint interview to CNN last night. Talking about her first day in the White House, Vice President Harris said she would strengthen America's middle class by increasing the child tax credit and curtailing price gouging on everyday goods. The Democratic candidate also said she would increase access to affordable housing, which remains a pressing concern among young voters. Vice President Harris also spoke highly of President Joe Biden and said she had no regrets serving under the commander-in-chief. However, the CNN anchor did zero in on the reversal made by Kamala Harris regarding her approach to fracking and migration. As a presidential candidate in 2019, Kamala Harris had opposed fracking, a stance she changed after joining the Biden campaign. Now, during her interview, the Democratic candidate said she will not ban fracking if elected president. Now, fracking is the method of extracting natural gas from the earth, which does have an impact on climate change. However, it does employ thousands across at least 30 states, including in some of the key battleground states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and North Carolina. Kamala Harris also made a U-turn on immigration when she once advocated for the border to be decriminalized. Now, during the interview, the Democrat said she supports the enforcement of laws against illegal immigration. And when asked about her potential cabinet, Harris said she would appoint a Republican to her team if she wins, though she did not hint at whom she had in mind. And speaking on Gaza, Kamala Harris said she was working for a ceasefire deal but would not move away from President Biden's policy on standing with Israel. Meanwhile, Tim Walz addressed comments about being in a combat zone as he apologized for misspeaking back in 2018 about being in a war. Now, Thursday's interview comes as early voting begins in some states in September. In fact, a new Reuters Ipsos poll post-interview shows Kamala Harris in a clear lead against her Republican rival. With the interview now in the books, Vice President Harris and her team are preparing for the September 10 showdown against Donald Trump in Philadelphia. And moving to Canada, scores of international students and tourists are protesting the recent changes to the country's latest immigration policy. Just yesterday, the Canadian government announced that temporary residents who hold a visitor visa will no longer be allowed to apply for a work permit. Earlier this week, the Trudeau government also reduced the number of foreign workers allowed under the low-wage stream. Now, this crackdown on work permits for visitors is a U-turn on a policy that was launched in August of 2020 to make up for Canada's labor shortage. Since then, Ottawa has issued almost 5 million visitor visas and over 600,000 work visas, with India sending the most immigrants, amounting to nearly 19% of new arrivals. With the new changes, these visitors can no longer apply for a work permit. However, there are still some exceptions. Applicants holding a valid study or work visa are eligible for opportunities and jobs in Canada. Additionally, any applicant's spouse or parents who hold a valid study or work permit visa will automatically qualify. Immigrants who are waiting for their permanent residence card are also eligible to apply for a work permit. Meanwhile, anyone claiming refugee protection or has been recognized as a refugee can apply to work in Canada. And lastly, if an applicant is a trader, investor, or a professional under the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, they too will be allowed to apply for the work permit. So as Canada continues to recalibrate its immigration policies, the impact on nearly 1 million temporary residents, foreign workers, and international students will be closely watched. Vladimir Putin is scheduled to visit Mongolia next week. This visit marks Putin's first trip to a member state of the International Criminal Court since a warrant was issued against him over suspected war crimes in Ukraine. According to the ICC's founding treaty, member states are obligated to detain suspects for whom an arrest warrant has been issued if they enter their territory. So, will Mongolia uphold this obligation and detain Putin, or will he be allowed to thwart the ICC's arrest warrant? Here's our report with more.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is set to make a controversial trip to Mongolia. This visit is notable because Mongolia is a member of the International Criminal Court that issued an arrest warrant for the Russian president in March 2023. The ICC accused Putin of war crimes, specifically the unlawful deportation of children from Ukraine, where Russia has been engaged in a conflict for over 2.5 years. And this trip marks Putin's first visit to an ICC member state since the warrant was issued.
The core of the allegation is that Ukrainian children have been deported or unlawfully transferred from parts of Ukraine into the Russian Federation unlawfully. The investigations have clearly showed that the allegations we put forward, the evidence we put forward are sound and have withstood judicial scrutiny at this stage of the proceedings.
The ICC mandate is clear. Member states are required to arrest any individual who has an outstanding warrant from the court. However, to make that arrest, the ICC lacks an enforcement mechanism. This has led to several high-profile failures in the past. Taking for instance, when Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir visited South Africa in 2015, even though the ICC issued an arrest warrant against him, South Africa did not detain al-Bashir, sparking international outrage and condemnation from human rights groups. Regarding the Russian leader's arrest, the Kremlin has repeatedly stated that it does not recognize the jurisdiction of the ICC. Instead, they've emphasized the purpose of this trip, which is to participate in ceremonies commemorating the 85th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet and Mongolian forces over Japan in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. The Kremlin even added that the Russian president is also expected to hold talks with the Mongolian president and other top officials. While the arrest warrant against Putin is unprecedented, since the issuance of the warrant, he has avoided ICC member countries. Last year, he skipped the BRICS summit in South Africa, which is another ICC member. During the summit, South Africa lobbied Moscow to avoid the awkward position of potentially having to arrest Putin, leading to a mutual agreement that he would not attend in person. Instead, he participated virtually using the platform to criticize the West.
The desire of some countries to maintain this hegemony led to the severe crisis in Ukraine. First, with the help of Western countries, an unconstitutional coup was carried out in this country, and then a war was unleashed against the people who didn't agree with this coup.
Russia's stance on the ICC remains firm, but now as Putin prepares to travel to Mongolia, questions loom. Will the Russian leader face an arrest, or does he have other assurances?
And finally, from Australia, a billionaire, Chris Ellison, stirred controversy when he declared his desire to hold his employees captive all day long. He expressed his distaste for coffee breaks and called them a costly distraction. His views have sparked backlash, with many criticizing his outdated approach to employee management. Our final story spills the beans.
I want to hold them captive all day long. This statement conjures up images of a masked villain, perhaps with an evil laugh. The phrase drips with a vindictive undertone that screams criminal. However, this wasn't uttered by some nefarious villain. This statement came from an Australian billionaire and was directed at his office staff, no less. At a financial presentation for Mineral Resources, a company worth a modest $5.44 billion, Managing Director Chris Ellison dropped this little gem of a statement of wanting to keep his staff under lock and key for nefarious reasons. Ellison just doesn't want them wandering off for a coffee break. After all, he figured out that a stroll down the street for a caffeine fix is in fact an expensive luxury. So if you're part of his workforce, don't even think about stepping outside the building, or at least that's the vibe he's giving off. But before you think he's all gloom and doom, Ellison has a grand solution. According to him, his company's headquarters isn't just an office, it's a paradise, where allegedly everyone loves to work. And why wouldn't they, with an in-house restaurant, a gym to stay fit, and even a creche for the little tykes at just $13, a steal when compared to the average $122. It's a veritable bargain, complete with doctors and nurses on standby. Your kids will be fed, entertained, and ideally won't cry enough to pull you away from your desk, because clearly toddlers are known for their predictability, right? Well, good luck with that, Ellison. In a world inching towards a 4-day work week, Ellison's views are as refreshing as a tumbleweed blowing through an empty office. Despite running a company with 5,600 employees, he's certain that flexible working is a no-go. He already banned working from home last year, and he's not stopping there. To him, the idea of working 3 days and collecting a 5-day paycheck, or heaven forbid, a 4-day one, is pure fantasy. Unsurprisingly, social media had a field day with his remarks. Some likened it to slavery. Others joked that he'd be installing barbed wire next. A few even called him out as downright menacing, while others simply thought he was out of touch with reality. This whole incident is nothing short of comedic. On one hand, Australia is moving towards a better work-life balance with laws like the right to disconnect. On the other, you have Chris Ellison, who has a problem with his employees stepping out of work for some coffee. Ellison is a masterclass in delusion if there ever was one.
That's our show for today. We certainly thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you right back here next week. From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
Kamala, you're fired.
I say, bring it on.
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill. We know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on Firstpost America.
Hello and welcome to Fast and Factual. My name is Utsav Parekh and here are the top stories of the day. Israel has agreed to a 3-day humanitarian pause in Gaza starting Sunday. According to the World Health Organization, Israel has agreed to pause the war for a polio vaccination drive in the war-torn strip. The WHO aims to vaccinate 640,000 children in this drive. The pause in the Israel-Hamas war follows the first case of polio in Gaza in 25 years. After agreeing to pause the fighting in Gaza for the polio vaccination drive, Israel's